Welcome to Responding to Cybersecurity Incidents, a portion of the full Cybersecurity First Responder course from Logical Operations. My name is Stacy McBride, and I will be your instructor for this course. Before we go too far, I'd like you to be able to get access to the course materials, and so if you'd like to open up a web browser to www.lo-choice.com, you'll be able to create a user account for yourself to gain access to those materials. In order to do this, you will need the access key that is displayed on this slide. You may want to write that down. It is capital LMO 1A 1X 5DJ. I'd like to do a quick demonstration to illustrate how to create the account. So I've got the LO Choice website open here, and you'll see under New User towards the bottom right, we can enter in the access key that was provided on the previous slide. Then click the Enroll button. Once you've done this, you can create your account by providing your email address, which normally will also be used as your username, and of course provide additional information like your first and last name and then your password. Now, you should make sure that you write down your logon name and your password so that you will be able to continue to have access to the course materials. Once you've done this, it will take you into the Logical Choice platform. But of course, if you come back later on and you want to log on, then you'll be able to simply log on using the account that you created, as I'm doing now. I'm providing my username and password under Returning User, and I will click OK. On your screen, you'll only see one tile. IDG and LO present responding to cybersecurity incidents, and that is the tile we'd like to click on now. From these tiles, you'll be able to access the course content. If you click on the ebook tile, there will be 3 links that will allow you to download the PDF file for each of the sessions that we'll be considering together during this course. You can print those out for later reference if you wish. The checklist tile takes you to some best practices and guidance related to cybersecurity, and the Learn To tile will take you to some brief videos that cover some additional topics that support some of the discussions that we're going to have together. If you click on the assessment tile, it will take you into a brief assessment that you could use to check to see how your understanding of cybersecurity stacks up. Maybe you'll want to do that after we complete our course together to see what you've learned. The Logical Labs link is going to be functional during a full version of the course, which would then allow you to access the actual online labs associated with the full Cybersecurity First Responder course. If you click on the Certification Map tile, it will take you through to the Cybersecurity First Responder website, where you can learn why CFR is important and how you can go about obtaining the certification. And then finally, if you click on the certification tile, it will take you through to the Logical Operations website, where you can purchase a voucher that will allow you to then take the actual certification exam and hopefully obtain your Cybersecurity First Responder certification. Now that you've got access to your courseware, we're going to begin our first session, Deploy an Incident Handling and Response Architecture. We need to design our incident handling and response capabilities up front so that we're going to be able to have the right processes, the right people, and the right tools in the right place at the right time. And so if we're able to do this, then that means we'll be able to respond to incidents in a timely manner. We'll be able to detect those incidents quickly and efficiently, respond, and then also identify the cause of those incidents. When an incident has been identified, we need to respond in order to protect our organization. And so one of the first concerns usually is to secure the data, to make sure that there's no additional exfiltration of data if any exfiltration has occurred. Then, of course, we want to contain the incident, trying to prevent it from spreading to infect other systems that may be within our organization. And of course, one of our primary goals would be to attempt to return to operations as normal as quickly as possible. Then after that has occurred, once we've got a little bit of time to do some analysis, we may start to dig into that incident, trying to determine how it actually occurred. What was the root cause of that incident? What led to it being successful? And of course, we want to try to figure out how to prevent that from happening again in the future. Also, we're going to look at how much damage or impact was caused to our organization overall, and we'll try to, again, reduce those impacts through implementing changes. And so we're going to update our security policies and procedures based on the lessons that we've learned from analyzing the incident. Disaster recovery planning is going to be essential if we're impacted by a large-scale incident or a disaster. And of course, this may involve recovering not just a single system, but it may in fact involve recovering our entire facility and all that it contains. And so we need to have good planning in place. Of course, one part of this would be to ensure that we do have an off-site backup of our information that is being stored securely so that we'll be able to recover from that. But just because you have your data doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily be able to rebuild and replicate or mirror the function that you had at your primary location that has suffered the disaster. This is because there's rarely any one person that really knows how everything was configured, or at least can remember how everything was configured. And so what we are going to do in order to facilitate that recovery is we may want to create a site book that contains detailed documentation of everything that we have at that particular location, a listing of all the inventory of all of our assets, how they've been configured, the protocols that we're using, the processes that are being used, and all of that information can be stored in the site book so that we can then use the information in that book to then rebuild when we do suffer a significant impact that could be caused by a disaster or other occurrence. The overall incident response process is illustrated here in these basic 10 steps, as you can see. Now, we start out with planning, and of course planning is going to be critical. If we don't plan before the incident occurs, then when the incident does occur, we're not going to be able to respond effectively. We want to be able to identify the various factors that we're going to be dealing with each particular type of incident, and so we're going to look at the potential risk of each of those things occurring and make sure that we've considered those. Then, of course, we're going to initiate our actual incident handling protocols when an incident does occur. And so we will identify the fact the incident has occurred. We'll go into our incident response and incident handling mode. We need to record and document the information regarding the incident, all of the details that we can capture, so that we can then move to the phase where we would evaluate and analyze that information that has been captured so that we can determine, again, the scope and impact of the incident. One of our primary goals, as we've stated many times, is that we want to ensure that we are containing that incident so that the incident is not going to spread and cause additional harm to the organization. We may then apply mitigations, controls that would reduce the impact to the organization and reduce the risk of perhaps this particular incident causing further harm, and possibly look at identifying the source of that particular incident so that we can reduce those negative effects. We may need to escalate issues that have been identified through to other teams or team members. We may need to obtain authorization from senior management in order to perhaps go further with our investigation. Because, of course, if we do decide to move on to perhaps using digital forensics to analyze what has happened, there's going to be a very real cost associated with that. And so we have to make sure that we've got approvals and funding to support that. We're going to then, of course, try to recover from the incident to return everything back to the state prior to the instance occurrence. And so everything will be returned back to normal, but not just to the same state, because that could then lead to the same incident occurring again. But of course, we want to make sure that when we do the recovery, we've integrated any changes that we've identified as being necessary to prevent this particular incident from occurring again. And then we will go into the review and report phase. Of course, very important that we document what made up the event and, of course, what we did in response to it and what we should have done, perhaps, and our recommendations from that. Out of that, of course, the documentation, we're going to hopefully conduct a lessons learned review. We'll create a lessons learned report that will describe the things that maybe we can do better so that we can deal with these incidents better in the future. Many large organizations are going to establish a security operations center that will allow them to monitor and protect their critical information assets. The SOCs are going to be used to coordinate security efforts, and they do vary in size and scope, but there are a few key principles that each SOC should be designed around, and these are the things that we see on the slide. So, of course, the SOC would be there to deal with incident response duties, and the SOC would have its authorization, its authority provided by organizational policies that would also control its operation and behavior. The members of the SOC, the team members, of course, need proper training, and that means that they need to understand the tools that they have available and just exactly what those tools can and cannot do. When the SOC is involved in monitoring, which is going to be one of its key functions, of course, the members there need to be properly trained in being able to separate relevant information from irrelevant information. You could say separate the signal from the noise, as mentioned on the slide here, so that we can identify items, events that are occurring that actually have significant meaning. Now, sometimes that's very difficult to do if you're just looking myopically at a single event. But, of course, we have many tools available to us like SIEM systems, Security Incident and Event Management Systems, that will allow us to aggregate and correlate information from across our enterprise and thereby be able to spot patterns that might then provide us with more security intelligence than we would see simply looking at a single event or log entry. The SOC, of course, is going to have to balance its size and presence in the organization because there's a cost, obviously, to operating this. And so its size and how much interaction it has with other departments needs to be managed carefully so that, of course, we don't end up alienating our workforce, but instead we are able to get them to buy in and help to provide the SOC with useful information related to events that may occur as well. The SOC is going to incorporate various security processes. It's going to leverage those strong processes in order to get the best benefit and bang for your buck. And everyone there, as I mentioned, need to be properly trained. So skilled professionals. Nothing would be more embarrassing than having your SOC itself compromised, and so we want to make sure the SOC also has its own defensive capabilities and that there is a focus there on operating securely as well. A cybersecurity incident response team, or CSIRT, is often going to be the members of that will staff that security operations center. But even if you don't have a SOC, you can still have members that make up a CSIRT for your organization. These individuals would be the ones that would be used to help to identify and then manage the security incidents as they occur. They would need proper training to be able to collect and preserve evidence related to the incidents, and of course follow various best practices and models that are available to guide that. Now, the actual structure of the CSIRT for an organization could vary from one organization to another, and so what we're going to do is we're going to select one of these models to create a CSIRT that is going to be most effective and fit best in with our own corporate structure. So we may have a single central team that manages the entire organization and deals with incidents across that organization. But generally, this is going to fit smaller organizations better than larger ones. In larger organizations, we may have multiple CSIRTs that would deal with different business units, and by doing this, we're going to be able to perhaps have quicker and more timely response, but also the members of those teams may be more familiar with what normal traffic and behavior in that part of the network and on those systems would look like, and they may be more adept at identifying anomalies, any type of indicator of compromise that could indicate that they are dealing with an incident that needs to be managed. And of course, when you have distributed teams, though, we will have to make sure they're all playing from the same playbook. So we need coordination typically. They have to collaborate with each other, but we may want to have a coordinating team, which would be an overarching team that would then manage and deal with any type of coordinated events that are enterprise-wide, but also ensure that everyone is using standardized policies, procedures, and tools across the organization. Now, there are CSIRTs also at the national level that you may or may not be familiar with. I've got a web page here from cert.org, and this web page is cert.org/incident-management/national-cserts/national-cserts.cfm. Now, on this page, you can see there's a list of CSIRTs for various countries throughout the world. And if you click on the one for the United States, which is quite a bit further down on the page, it will take you through to the US CERT page. And so here we do have a web page that gives us a lot of good information about what's going on and what's relevant to the United States. If you were to click on, for an example, alerts and tips on this page, you'd be able to see things like current activity and current alerts that might be relevant. So there's various current activity items that are popping up here. Google releases a security update for Chrome, July 21st, for an example. If we go back to alerts, you'll see that we can list alerts for 2016. And of course, ransomware is something that everyone's dealing with. It's a very serious problem. And so this is an alert about ransomware and gives us a description of what it is and how to deal with it, how to protect ourselves as well. So lots of good information. And this is the type of information that we can leverage using these national CERT teams, but also learning from them. And of course, if we're a large enough organization, then we would have our own hierarchy and structure to propagate information between our CERT teams as well. Within each CSIRT, we've got to make sure that our members, our team members, understand what their roles are. And in order to do this, we, of course, usually are going to have to make sure that they are properly trained and that they know exactly what it is that they need to do if an incident occurs. So we will have perhaps a manager or team lead that would supervise the CSIRT and the CSIRT members dealing with the people issues typically, and of course making sure that resources are available for the team where and when they need them. We'll have investigators that would be used to actually dig in and determine the source of an incident and try to identify root cause related to that. We may have also security specialists that are going to be individuals with specialized knowledge and training for certain systems. And so you may have a security specialist that deals with your intrusion detection systems, or possibly a firewall specialist, something along those lines. Maybe a malware specialist, but someone with that specialized knowledge and training that can help out. The help desk staff will also, of course, be involved because they may be dealing with employee and customer concerns that are being fielded during the incident. When an incident occurs, of course, those individuals may be impacted. They may not be able to get access to the resources that they rely on, and so we need to communicate with them and manage that relationship so that they're kept up to date and understand the current state of the incident and the potential time for resolution and restoration of service. We may need, in more serious incidents, to have a crisis communicator who would be tasked with communicating any details of the incident out to stakeholders, and perhaps even communicating with the media if that becomes essential or necessary. And of course, in some organizations, we're going to be subject to government regulatory controls that will dictate that notifications must be made during certain types of incidents. And so we're going to ensure that we've got someone properly trained for those types of communications so that they say what needs to be said without causing additional harm to the organization by saying the wrong thing. We will also perhaps require auditors involved to evaluate our existing policies and our procedures to make sure that those things are being followed during our incident response. And so in this way, we're going to be able to validate whether those policies and procedures are effective or not, and whether our people are properly trained and adhering to them. We may need to talk to our legal counsel, depending again upon what is involved in the incident. If we're dealing with a compliance issue for regulatory compliance, that could become an issue. Or if there are criminal actions or suspected criminal actions involved, then we may want to look to them for legal guidance as to how to proceed as well. In some cases, software developers may form part of the team because they may actually build and maintain tools that are used, especially scripts. Many times, many of our functions may be repetitious, and so if you've got someone that's very good with some of our scripting languages, they could automate many of our tasks that would be used to collect and analyze our information, and so developers may be a very effective part of the team in that respect. There are many different types of activities that the CSIRT will perform on a daily basis, and of course, one of the things that they'll need to do will be to take an immediate action when an incident occurs, responding to that incident. And some of the things that they're going to want to do would be, of course, to keep in mind that they are trying to protect systems from the damage or harm that the intruder could cause, identify workarounds to be able to deal with that issue. If there's no direct patch for the problem, maybe there's a way to work around that to be able to preserve access for authorized users. And also look for additional signs of intruder activity to identify whether the intruder's actions are spreading to other systems. And then, of course, a primary goal would be trying to restore those systems and patch them, making sure that they are protected from additional attacks or similar attacks. Then they move on to perhaps doing some analytical problem solving. We're looking at trying to identify additional safeguards that we might put in place to help to protect our systems. We often will learn from each incident that occurs, and based on that learning, we might be able to identify better ways to adopt a different defensive posture, introducing new solutions, new tools that will help to protect us. We will, of course, continue to monitor for new occurrences, new alerts. And one thing that we would be looking at is not just alerts that are being generated from our systems, but again, going out to things like those national CSIRT teams and other security news lists that we might subscribe to, because very often if certain types of attacks are becoming more common, more prevalent, then we want to make sure that we are going to be proactively defending against those. And so we would be researching relevant advisories and alerts to try to then, again, assume a proper defensive posture. We're going to always look at new strategies for dealing with new threats and make sure that we do have those detection capabilities in place so that when we see things coming in, we're able to respond appropriately. Communication will be a big part of being a CSIRT team member because we will need to communicate and coordinate with our other team members and with stakeholders within the organization. And especially We're going to be integrating with, of course, our IT functions, our compliance functions, and the various business operations so that they're going to be kept abreast of what's going on with our efforts as well. We may also have to communicate with vendors or maybe even consultants that have been brought in to deal with the issues. CSIRT team members are going to need to be able to change. We know that the only thing that you can count on today is change. And in the security world, there's always going to be new threats. There's always going to be new vulnerabilities. There's always going to be new solutions to help to defend ourselves against those. And so we have to be constantly on a learning cycle, looking at how we can better adjust the way that we're protecting our organization. And team members may also conduct tabletop exercises discussing scenarios that could occur and then determining whether our current policies and procedures adequately cover off those scenarios or whether we need to make adjustments. And a key factor here, too, that we want to consider is that while one of the primary functions of the CSIRT is to restore service, another function is going to be able to capture and successfully collect evidence in such a way that it may potentially be used in a legal action, perhaps criminal, perhaps a lawsuit, a civil action. And so it's very important that the CSIRT team members be properly trained to handle that information so that it's not damaged, to handle the evidence so it's not damaged, and also to ensure that they don't accidentally expose or compromise sensitive information during their investigations. And so we're going to make sure that we protect the privacy, the confidentiality of our information, as well as ensuring that evidence is protected. Within the CSIRT, we understand that once a security incident has occurred, then we need to make sure that we are communicating effectively, and we should have processes in place that describe how this should occur. Now, ahead of time, we should develop a communication process that describes how we will communicate. And so we're going to need to, as we're defining this process, we're going to need to identify the internal individuals that we're going to contact when an incident occurs, as well as the external individuals. We also need to determine when it is appropriate to notify our CSIRT team members and to call them to action. So, of course, we will have some members that will be monitoring, but at what point do we need to bring in the rest of the team and declare that we do have an incident that needs the full investigation? We need to think about how our communications may occur, especially if we're dealing with a severe incident, because we may have to look at communications during a time when normal channels are not available. And so we want to have a secure communication channel. Many times organizations will define that secure channel that will be used, but then we also may need to plan for out-of-band communication that may need to occur if our primary channel is compromised or lost. So if you normally would use telephone communications or cell phones, often in severe disaster situations, those mechanisms don't work as well. They get jammed up because of the volume of calls. So we might want to have two-way radios or something like that available for the incident response team to use. We need to make sure that everything is clearly documented and everyone is properly trained so that they understand their role in the process. And remember that if you don't test it, then you really don't have a functioning process at all. Now, of course, there are many different individuals that could be involved in the incident, even people outside of the CSIRT team. And so we want to leverage those people as much as we can because they may be able to provide useful context and information regarding the incident. So victims that were affected perhaps could provide details of what they saw and what they believe may have been affected. Those victims may be the users of the systems, so they may be intimately familiar with what is at risk as well. We might speak with potential perpetrators of the incident, if these are insiders at least. And, of course, when we're interviewing them, we would have to take everything they would say with a grain of salt because they're likely to deny their involvement, but they may still be able to provide useful information by the things that they do not say or perhaps by the way that they respond to the questions they're asked. We may have to coordinate with law enforcement if we've identified the need for some type of legal action, or if we've identified something that's involved in the incident. For instance, child pornography would, at least in most countries, trigger an immediate call to law enforcement. System administrators are going to be a very useful resource as well, because they're going to be familiar with the normal baseline of the systems and what normal behavior on their systems perhaps looks like. And so we could ask them whether the things that we're seeing are typical or atypical. And then our managers and our executives may need to be contacted in order to provide decisions that may involve spending money or various things related to handling the incident that could perhaps expose the organization to additional risk, so that we get proper approval and funding as well. And so we'd want to leverage all of these individuals. To identify that an incident has occurred, there are many indicator sources that we might look to. Now, of course, the first thing that may jump into your mind would be log files. And yes, we'll be looking at those, of course, but there are many other mechanisms that may be useful and could provide indicators of compromise to our team. And of course, by looking at all of these different sources, we're going to have a more holistic view of our enterprise and perhaps be able to identify incidents that we may have missed if we were just looking at a single source of information. One of the challenges that we may face is that the number of alerts that we receive could be quite large. And of course, because of this, we may need to perhaps set a clipping level, as it were, to throttle the number of entries that are being generated or events being generated. And we also understand that the different sources we're looking at here have different levels of sensitivity and accuracy. And so, in addition to burying us in events, we may also be exposed to a large number of false positives. Now, false positives mean that, of course, it looks like we may be experiencing a security incident, but it's not true. And so we have to, as a first responder, look at these indicators of compromise, but one of our first actions would be to, of course, try to filter out those false positives as early as possible so that we're not wasting a lot of time investigating those, leaving more time for the more relevant, significant events. So, various sources, of course, would include things like our anti-malware software, and that would, of course, be triggered if we match a virus signature. Our intrusion detection systems, whether they're host or network-based systems, could provide us with alerts. For instance, on a network system, it could alert if it sees a particular signature that matches maybe malware being sent across the network, or maybe just a port scan being detected could trigger the IDS. On a host-based system, maybe we see that a critical file no longer matches its pre-calculated cryptographic hash, which means the file has changed. And so we can detect that change, and by detecting the change, maybe that's an indicator of compromise. We're always going to check our log files. System logs could indicate perhaps that a user has logged onto the system, perhaps that the system has been shut down or the system clock has been changed, those sorts of things. Network devices might, of course, expose things like maybe if you've got a firewall log, maybe it shows that there have been repeated connection attempts that have been dropped. And again, these could indicate that someone's attempting to get into our systems. I mentioned the Security Information and Event Management System previously, and we understand that this goes far beyond just simply collecting the logs in one common location, but a SIEM system can collect log files from all of your systems, your servers, even workstations, your network devices, switches, routers, firewalls, IDS systems, and of course aggregate all those log entries together and analyze those and correlate the information that's occurring in those logs so that, again, we can automatically identify patterns that could indicate compromise. And using these types of solutions today can make it much, much more possible. We may have devices that will monitor and measure the flow of traffic on the network. And so by monitoring the volume of traffic, especially for specific protocols or to specific ports, we may then be able to identify, again, anomalous volumes of traffic that could indicate perhaps denial of service, or maybe even malware that is now generating a lot of outbound traffic that is not normal. Internal personnel could act as our canaries in the coal mine because, of course, they are often used to the way systems should behave. And when systems begin behaving abnormally, then they could report that. And, of course, they may also be able to testify as to what they observed while a system was actually being breached or compromised. Outside the organization, you might have perhaps hacking groups and others that perhaps take responsibility for a particular hack. And in that case, again, that information might also act as an IOC for other events at other organizations if the MO, you could say, is similar to the events being generated by this hacker group in other incidents that have occurred for other organizations. And of course, we can look at research, and looking at third-party research, vulnerability databases, and so on, we may be able to identify new threats, new trends, and these things could also, taken together with these other indicator sources, help us to identify whether we are experiencing any type of true security incident or not. The damage that could be caused by an incident could vary widely from almost nothing to severe consequences. And so we do want to evaluate what has occurred. Now, of course, our information is one of the most valuable things in most organizations. And so we need to look at what damage may have been caused to the value of that data. Often we'll rate this using what is called CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information. And we'll describe the impact in those terms. Was the confidentiality breached? Do we have exfiltration of information? Was the integrity of the data harmed? So we'd be looking at a corruption of our data perhaps. Or is the data no longer available? Has it been destroyed? Or perhaps is the system that provides that information under denial of service attack and it's not available for access by any authorized user. So we're going to look at things like those changes to the data, theft, disclosure, and interruption of services. And so CIA pretty much sums it up. Now, the impact to our organization could either be tangible or intangible. The impacts could actually affect, things that we can touch and feel. Corrupting data on a hard drive maybe is a tangible thing. But if the impact to our organization is simply that our website was down, so we maybe lost obtaining a new customer that may have signed up, but because the website was down, they did not. Well, that's maybe an intangible. If we're dealing with a loss of reputation, where perhaps our customers lose confidence in our organization, that could also be something that's intangible. So we don't want to underestimate also the scope of the impact to the organization, because we know that the impacts could be widespread, and we need to really look at the organization very broadly, looking at all the different aspects of the organization to determine how it may have been impacted by the incident. Then we want to move on to evaluation and analysis of the incident. We do understand that many events that occur are going to end up being false positives, and so they aren't true security incidents. So we need to separate those false positives from the true positives. And so in order to do this, we're going to want to make sure that we first of all understand or have a baseline so that we know what the organization looks like. We understand as well that just because we have an event that has occurred that perhaps could cause harm to the organization, it may not necessarily be treated as a security incident because perhaps it wasn't an actual attack. Maybe there was just some accidental thing that occurred, and once we've done our investigation, we determined that it was an accident. Someone just needs a little additional training, or perhaps we need to lock down permissions additionally to avoid those types of accidents in the future. In any case, in order to determine whether something is a true positive or a false positive, we usually are going to want to correlate information from multiple sources, alerts, log entries, and other indicators of compromise until we get a comprehensive enough picture that we'll be able to determine whether the incident really and truly is a true positive. In order to help with this, if we understand what normal behavior looks like on the network and on the system, that's going to be very helpful during our analysis. And of course, we need to make sure that we've got log files that we've configured ahead of time, that we're able to capture adequate levels of information from all appropriate sources. Now, of course, there's a trade-off here because if we are capturing too many events in a log file, we're going to be buried with details, and it's going to use up more processing time and a lot more storage space in order to handle those log files. But if you don't record something in a log, then that information just simply will never be available to you during an investigation. And so we have to make sure that that's tuned properly up front. We are going to try to identify all the potential sources of information, all the indicators of compromise, and we, of course, understand that in many cases, our organization may not even become aware of an incident until weeks or months following the actual incident itself. And so we've got to make sure that all of these information sources are being recorded and stored so that we can perform this analysis after the fact, many, many months after the fact in some cases. In fact, there are what we call advanced persistent threats today. These are usually very capable, large organizations that are funded, and they are determined, and they have skills and tools that they will use to launch massive cyber campaigns against commercial assets and government assets in other countries typically. And when we investigate these APTs, it's often found that they have obtained access to organizations' networks and maintained that access for months and even years at a time before being discovered. If you want to check that out, Mandiant is an organization that wrote a report on one of the first APTs that really there was a report on. It's called APT-1, and Mandiant, in their analysis, determined that it was a People's Liberation Army unit in China that was actually conducting these attacks, and they had compromised hundreds of organizations and, again, maintained access for months or years. So your logs need to be preserved for a long period of time so that you can analyze these things. The correlation we do, we're trying to look for patterns, of course, and we're trying to take those patterns and try to identify improper behaviors. We need to get information from our reputable sources, and of course we've pointed to some of these things like national CERT teams and of course vendor databases of security-related information. We want to try to filter out any irrelevant or inconsequential information because, again, we got to get rid of the noise and focus on the important information and data. And then, of course, document our findings so that we can learn from them and build on them in future investigations. Containing the incident is going to be one of our key goals because we want to make sure that our organization doesn't suffer harm. And of course, at the top of the list, the main thing here is, number one, the safety and security of our personnel. So that's first and foremost always. And then secondly, we want to make sure that our facilities themselves are secured. We're going to move on from that to try to stop the spread of the incident, perhaps by disconnecting devices from the network, or perhaps disabling various types of communication, disabling network communications, user accounts, email accounts, anything that we feel might be involved in the incident that could be spreading the problem, we're going to disable, and perhaps even disconnecting access to a subnet if there's an entire subnet that is involved. Often you'll see that attacks coming from external sources will be hitting your demilitarized zone, or DMZ, which is normally going to be an isolated subnet. Now, we may be able to restrict or contain the communications within that area. We may want to isolate the compromised system, so if it is infected with malware, perhaps, that doesn't spread. And we are going to try to treat this compromised system and interconnected systems as a crime scene, so that we are going to preserve that. We're going to document it, photograph it, video. We're going to label everything, and we're going to collect our evidence, the physical as well as the digital evidence, in line with criminalistic principles, following the rules of evidence, so that hopefully what we collect will be useful if we do have to engage in some type of legal action. The intent, once we've identified our incident and contained it, then we are going to want to try to handle that incident, reducing its impact to the organization and then eradicating it so that we can get back into a normal operational state. So the goal will be to try to stop the incident and get rid of its negative effects, figuring out which systems have been impacted, how they've been impacted, and then, of course, we're going to try to clean those things up, would be our next step after this. So the example given there is you've identified a worm that was spreading on your network, you've isolated those subnets, and then once you've done that, perhaps you can now use some type of anti-malware removal tool to remove that worm from the systems after that isolation. And again, the long-term goal, get back to operations as normal. Our incident recovery steps are going to vary depending upon the actual nature of the incident that has occurred, but some examples would be, as shown here, if a malicious user deleted data, then of course we'd restore it. We could perhaps reboot a server and check to see if it has any lingering issues, if it's been impacted by denial of service, or maybe if there's malware on a device, if we can't effectively remove the malware, we might have to re-image that device or wipe it and rebuild it. So these are some of the recovery samples that you might deal with. Now, we also need to understand what roles are going to be involved in these recovery efforts. Within the CSIRT, we're going to have different individuals tasked with different functions or roles, and so we may end up with the recovery role needing to communicate through to leadership with regard to what's going on in order to get proper approvals related to our recovery efforts so that they can make appropriate decisions. The CSIRT members may also need to be able to provide information about the current state of affairs with the recovery operations so that your crisis communicator can then, of course, communicate that through to the appropriate individuals. And the team members would also perhaps need to provide follow-up support for customers and partners that have been impacted, because there may be a lot of public relation work that needs to be done, but their systems also may need to have some reconfiguration or hardening done to prevent them from being impacted by similar events. At the end of this, we need to have a formal lessons learned report generated, or after action report. So you may see either of those terms, an AAR, after action report, or a lessons learned report. And this is really the output of the lessons learned meeting. The goal here is to, again, identify what went on in this particular incident, and then from analyzing that, gain insight as to changes that we can make to enhance security in our organization in the future. We want to identify what elements of our security we can improve and how we can improve those. And so part of the lessons learned will be doing a post-mortem where we'll say, what did we do? Was it the best thing? Was it just a Band-Aid, or was it a permanent cure? Is there the solution that we use something that we can use again in the future, or do we need to change it? If it's something we can use consistently, do we need to document that as a policy or a procedure that's going to be followed? Is there a better way to do things? How did our team members respond? Was the response appropriate? Was it in compliance with our policies and procedures? Could it have been done more quickly or effectively? Are there new tools we might need to consider that would make us more effective in handling that particular type of incident? And how would we respond differently if we could do so? If there was no budget concerns, how would you deal with it, for an example? And then determine whether that's appropriate for our organization. And do we need to make those changes to the policies? So these are some of the lessons that may be learned from the analysis of the incident. We need our team members to be familiar with and properly trained on various incident handling tools. And this is just an example of some tools that might be involved in some of our analysis work. Now, if we're going to be doing any type of digital forensic analysis, as we'll deal with later in some of our additional lessons, we're going to need to be able to create disk images. Now, disk images are not just file-by-file copies, but these are going to be created using software that creates bit-for-bit, sector-by-sector copies of a disk or a partition. The images that are created in this way need to be verifiable as identical to the original. And so in order to do this, most of our tools are going to create a hash calculation that on the original drive and a hash calculation on the resulting copy. And of course, if those hash values are identical, then we can prove in court that those files match. So looking at these tools, for instance, EnCase is from Guidance Systems, and Guidance System is one of the big players in digital forensics. Another one that's mentioned there is actually the FTK Imager. Now, the FTK Imager is a free download actually from Access Data, and if you're interested in obtaining a copy of that, you can reach out, go to Access Data and download their FTK Imager, and you can see here on the FTK Imager that it has the capability of creating disk images, but also capturing memory, which is very important when we're dealing with digital forensics. And you can do some rudimentary analysis with this tool. So anyway, you can check that one out if you have a little bit of free time. It was Access Data. To look at network shares, we've got tools like BuySoft Network Share Browser, NetShare Watcher as well. User rights management tools, Novell ZenWorks, Windows users and groups, or if it's an Active Directory network, maybe Active Directory users and computers. To recover information that's been deleted, we have tools like TestDisk and Foremost. TestDisk is actually available on multiple platforms, and it is a free tool. You can access and download that. The same organization that creates TestDisk, which is useful for recovering deleted files, we also have what is called PhotoRec. And PhotoRec goes even further than TestDisk. Where TestDisk might recover a deleted file or partition, PhotoRec can do data carving, which means that we can have a disk that's got files that have been damaged, scattered all over the surface of the disk, no directories left whatsoever. PhotoRec can identify files just simply by scanning the surface of the disk, finding the characteristic header patterns for those files, and reassembling file content. So that's a great tool for forensics as well. If we're doing any network analysis, Wireshark is great for analyzing PCAP files that might be captured on our different network devices. We can also use Wireshark and tools like Packetalizer and TCP dump to capture and analyze traffic in real time while an attack is going on. Cain Enable is a great password cracking workbench. Basically, it's a GUI tool, very effective and useful. You can download that from a company called oxid.it. Now, understand, again, there's a risk to downloading things from the internet, so if you run out and do that, make sure that, of course, you do it in a safe way. Make sure your system's patched, antivirus is up to date, and maybe use those tools on a system that you're willing to lose that's air-gapped from other critical systems until you've got a level of confidence that there's no undocumented functionality built inside that product. Generally, Cain Enable, unless it's Trojan, it should be relatively safe. I've used it for many years. John the Ripper, Unix-based or Linux-based password cracking utility. And of course, we often might need to use password crackers if for instance, we're trying to get into accounts that have been created as backdoor accounts to see exactly what they've got access to, and just simply to analyze the strength of the passwords on our systems. And then we've got the tools for analyzing network traffic as well, and things like Nmap, which can be used to do port scans and ping sweeps to find live hosts. Attackers may use these tools, so we should be familiar with them. Netcat can do scans as well. It can also be used as a mechanism to set up communications between two systems on a network. It can act like a telnet server and as a telnet client as well. So anyway, there are many different tools available to us, and we need to become familiar with them. Now, in the course, of course, we are looking at an organization, a fictitious organization called DevelTech. And in the course, there's an incident that is going to occur. So we're going to consider here, before we get into our first activity, the circumstances surrounding this incident that has occurred. Now, you can see that there have been multiple attempts to remotely access Charles' account from a specific IP address. And because of those attempts, Charles' account was locked out, and Charles says that he wasn't trying to log in. So it seems someone else may have been trying to get in through Carl's account. And Charles, he oversees the R&D, or research and development server, that holds new product data. So, of course, maybe somebody's trying to get at that information. Now, interestingly, Linda actually accessed that R&D server at 7:43 a.m. from her workstation, but she's on vacation. So, what we've got here are some indicators of compromise, don't we? These things look very suspicious on the surface, for sure. Now, an attacker, apparently, as we learned, attempted to use Charles' account to connect remotely, but that failed. Then, before most people got into the office, 7:43 a.m., the attacker went to Linda's desk, because we know she's on vacation, discovered her password somehow. Now, in this case, they're telling you that Linda had written her password down. It was inside her drawer. Maybe it's on a Post-it note on her screen. Maybe it's under her keyboard. Those are the usual places. But anyway, we teach our people not to do those things. But in this case, Linda wrote down her password, and it was discovered. And, of course, whoever this was logged on to her workstation and was able to access that R&D server. While on that server, the attacker copied a smartwatch schematic from her workstation, or I should say to her workstation, and then copied that off to a removable disk. Then the document was deleted from Linda's workstation. They ejected the USB drive and they left. So obviously we've got a data breach situation here, and so this is what we're starting to investigate. Now, this incident summary and scenario is the foundation of what we're going to be considering in the remainder of the lessons in this particular topic and in the next module as well that we're going to be considering together. So we're actually going to go through and we're going to do a little bit of forensic work on the evidence. And after we get through all 6 of our lessons together, you'll see how that evidence can be analyzed and how we can learn from the information that is presented digitally. So this brings us through to Activity 10-1. Now, if you look in your courseware, you'll see that in Activity 10-1, they instruct us to look at a document, to consider some questions, and then also to look at some instant forms on the SANS.org website. So I would suggest that you perhaps pause now at this point, look at those files, do the consideration of these points, try to answer these questions, and then you can start the recording again, and I will review the material that we're considering. Okay, so I hope that you had a good chance to look at those documents, and let's jump in and have a look at them ourselves here together. So the document you were asked to consider is this NIST Special Publication 800-61R2. Of course, you may notice that NIST actually has a large collection of security-related documents within this series, and you might want to look at some of those others as well. But in this document, they asked us to look at page 26 under section 2.44. And in this section, we were going to be asked a question about this section. Now, you'll see that this section lists information about the members in the team. We're going to have management, we're going to have information assurance, IT support, we may have legal, public affairs, human resources, business continuity planning, and physical security that could be involved in our response. And so the question is, what members of the organization will help you deal with the current incident, and which others would you routinely include in the CSIRT? And so, of course, as we look at that list, we can see that our team members might include things like management, IT, human resources, physical security, and so on. Then we're asked to jump to page 67 to review some additional information related to this. And on page 67, we're asked to scroll down to incident details. So as we look at the incident details, we are asked to look at those, and then it says, which of these questions can you answer now, and what additional questions would you ask about the incident based on what you know so far? And so incident details that we'd be concerned with is, has the status of anything changed? Where did the incident occur? What was the potential source or cause of the incident, if we know what that is? We need the description of the incident. We need to determine what assets were affected, which resources were affected, and how would we categorize the incident, and what was the vector of attack? In other words, how did they get in? Were there traffic patterns, registry keys impacted? What was it? What prioritization factors might we have for our incident response here? Is this a significant impact? Is it a critical system? How recoverable is the information? Are there any mitigating factors in this incident? For an example that they give here, the incident was perhaps a theft of a laptop that contained sensitive information, but a mitigating factor would be if that laptop had an encrypted hard drive. And then what actions did we take in response, and did we contact anyone else? So those are examples of the information that we might capture there. Now, there's a lot more good information in this document, and you're likely going to want to read through that entire NIST document when you have more detail. We're also encouraged to go to this SANS website and open up one of the instant forms. So I'll jump over to my SANS website here, hopefully. And this is the sample incident handling forms that are on the URL that's provided there. And so as you look at these forms, I'm going to choose the incident identification form as an example. When I click on that, you'll see that this allows us to collect information that allows us to identify the incident. So these documents are, that are made available here freely are a good source of structure that we can use in our incident response. So if we don't use these forms, we can at least use them as a template to create our own forms. So we would record information about who detected the incident, time and date, where it occurred, any additional information, and then summary. What type of incident was detected? What was its location? How was it detected? So by filling in this information, we're going to then be able to identify the incident and then move forward using some of these other forms to collect additional information. So if you've gone through those steps, then we've now completed our activity. So this brings us to the end of our first lesson. Of course, you'll want to come back for the second lesson. And if you want to get more detailed information on the Cybersecurity First Responder course, check out the links shown below or make a phone call. And of course, download the CFR exam objectives and look into actually obtaining the CFR exam voucher. So I'll see you back here for lesson 2.